Be the envy of the neighborhood. 860 KKAT, where the grass is always greener. Welcome to Gardening Utah. Here's composter and show hoster, Jana Francis.
Welcome to Gardening Utah. I'm your host, Jana Francis. Every week here on Gardening Utah, we give you gardening inspiration and advice from experts across the state. We talk about vegetables, flowers, trees, shrubs, and of course, your lawn. Thank you for listening. I hope this show is something that you'll look forward to checking in with every week. Whether you're a beginner or an expert, Gardening Utah aims to inspire you and keep you in the know of what tasks you should be accomplishing in your yard and meet amazing, informative experts along the way. This show airs on the radio on the weekends here in Utah at 10 a.m. on 860 AM KKAT, and episodes drop every weekend on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, so hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode. On today's show, we are going to get you ready well in advance to put your garden to bed. I can't even believe I'm saying that out loud. It doesn't feel right. I'm just loving this weather. The fall is my absolute favorite. I probably said that this year about spring too, but seriously, this weather has been amazing. And it's just, the garden is just exploding after, that heat this summer that was just so extreme. Now that everything gets a little bit of a break and, that we've had some rainfall, everything is just looking so gorgeous. But we're going to get you guys ready in advance because over the next few weeks, we are going to be putting our gardens to bed, unfortunately. So we're going to get you ready for that. And this is an encore episode that we did last fall with Liz Hamilton and Cameron Alcott. And there is some really funny stuff in here. So we had to bring it back. We give you amazing tips, but we also have so much fun in this episode. So that's what we're going to get to right after this. But first, can you believe I heard on the news this week that we are going to have a freeze sometime next week in certain parts of Utah. I believe it was slated for Tuesday night. So we're going to learn what's the difference between a frost and the freeze right here in the tip of the week.
860 KKAT with your Gardening Utah tip of the week.
My tip of the week is what in the world to do for your crops when there's going to be a frost or a freeze. So let's talk about a frost and a freeze. So a frost is defined as a covering of minute ice needles that forms on surfaces at or below freezing. Even if the actual temperature isn't freezing, a wind chill can cause the moisture in a plant to freeze. And a frost also has come to mean a brief dip in temperatures to freezing or just below with or without ice crystals. So a freeze, on the other hand, occurs when the temperature drops well below freezing and may or may not include ice crystals. So the amount of time below freezing to warrant a freeze warning varies depending on your geography. So freeze warnings are issued when temperatures will be below freezing for a sufficient amount of time to do damage to vegetation. So what's the difference between a frost and a freeze? Well, frost occurs on a cold, clear, still night as the heat radiates from surfaces into the air and the temperature drops below 32 degrees and water vapor freezes on those surfaces. So a light covering of hay, a slight overhang of a tree, or anything like a blanket on top of your tomatoes, like I did, anything that helps hold air will prevent too much damage from a frost because it helps hold the slight bit of heat released as the moisture freezes. And the reason most frost happens on clear nights is because the clouds and fog help hold heat closer to the earth, usually preventing a frost. So clear nights carry more risk of a frost. Now, a freeze is when very cold air blows into the area and the air is colder than freezing, which is 32 degrees, and there is wind and the humidity is very low. So a freeze warning is issued for 3 or more hours of temperatures that are going to be between 27 and 32 degrees over a widespread area. And that is when you got to get out there and you got to cover your plants or move those indoors, anything that's cold sensitive that you want to survive that freeze. And then a wind chill advisory means that very cold air and gusty winds will combine to generate low wind chills. So both can cause damage to most vegetation, but you can survive certain circumstances depending on weather, and that's why it's important to really understand the difference between a frost and a freeze. So keep an eye on that weather forecast Don't be afraid to get out there and cover your plants, especially if better weather is on the horizon.
And that's your Gardening Utah Tip of the Week, brought to you by The Advocates. If you're in an accident, you deserve an advocate. Call 801-355-5550 or visit utahadvocates.com. Never miss a tip for your garden and never miss an episode. The Gardening Utah Podcast with Jana Francis on 860 KKAT.
So I'm crossing my fingers for all of our gardens next Tuesday night, you guys. It looks like in Salt Lake City it's just going to get cold, real cold, but it doesn't look like we'll have a frost or a freeze. But a lot of our outlying areas, you are going to be dealing with that. So don't give up on your garden because you'll probably have a couple good weeks after it. You know what I mean? Anyway, so a couple cool events I want to tell you guys about that are upcoming in the next week. For those of you up in the Davis and Weber County areas at Botanicals in Kaysville, they are going to be having a really cool class on September 25th, all about lawn care and maintenance and how to prep your lawn for winter. So it's going to be at Botanicals on Saturday from 10 to 11 a.m. with local turf expert Corey Wheeler. So you can register for that just by going to the Botanicals Kaysville Facebook page and sign up through Eventbrite to be there. The classes there are awesome. And now I want to tell you about Flip Blitz. Now, this is sounding so much fun. So it's through Localscapes. And if you've been thinking about flipping your park strip, but you really are not exactly sure how you're going to complete each individual step, you can do Flip Blitz. And it's a chance for you to volunteer a little of your time. But in exchange, you will learn how to flip your own strip with expert guidance from Localscapes and all of their professional partners who will be working on each project. So the way you find out more is go to Localscapes Facebook page, and there's a link that you'll find that will give you more information. But on Tuesday, September 21st, starting at 9, they're going to be flipping 4 park strips in 4 different cities. There's one in Murray, Sandy, West Valley, and in Harriman. So you can sign up, and it's just a great opportunity to kind of learn how to do it firsthand while giving a little bit of your, a little elbow grease at the same time. And it sounds like you get a few things, a t-shirt, and they might have some media attention there as well, which could be kind of cool. Maybe you'll end up on Channel 5. Anyway, so those are kind of 2 fun things coming up in Utah. And now I want to give a shout out to some of our amazing recent 5-star reviews on iTunes. I was so humbled when I read these, and I would just love it if you would take a minute. It really helps our show grow and continue. And I'd love it if you'd just take a quick minute, head on to Apple Podcast or Spotify and give us a 5-star review and let us know what you think of the show. It really does help us get exposure in Apple Podcast and iTunes and Spotify as well. So this is from Lizard Sister. And they say, Jana always has such good information and interesting guests. I always have to have a pen and paper handy to make notes. This is especially true when Cameron is a guest. I never miss an episode. Well, that is awesome. Thank you so much, Lizard Sister. And I'm sure Cameron will love to hear this as well. And he is such a great friend to the show and will be on this particular episode. Okay, this one is from Callie Garn. Callie says, informative and entertaining. Aw. This is one of my favorite podcasts to listen to. I love the relevant information and that it covers all things in the yard. From grass to flowers and veggies, Jana has you covered with her tips, tricks, and myth debunking. Her wisdom and, quote, sage advice can help turn your yard into an oasis. Now listen, Callie, I did not pay you to write that, but you have a knack for this, so you're hired. Anyway, thank you so much for taking the time to write such kind things. It really does keep me going, and it really helps the show get exposure in those platforms when people start searching up different things. So thank you so much. And listen, let's get ready to unfortunately, put our gardens to bed for the winter. And we've got none other than Cameron Alcott and the amazing Liz Hamilton right after this on Gardening Utah. Stay with us.
She's more than just gardening puns and sage advice. It's Gardening Utah with Jana Francis on 860 KKAT. Gardening Utah, available wherever you get your podcasts and at 860kkat.com/garden. Here's Jana Francis.
Welcome back to Gardening Utah. I'm your host, Jana Francis, and we have a very special episode today. We have Cameron Alcott with Progressive Plants and Liz Hamilton, horticulturist. and they're with us to do a full episode on all of your questions regarding fall planting. So we have listeners in the Utah Gardeners group that are asking some questions right now that we are going to answer through this episode. And let's start really quick with something you posted the other day, Cameron. You had mentioned that fall is the perfect time to plant most things, especially in the ornamental and perennial space. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, I think one of the things that's kind of happened over the years is that the nursery business has taken advantage of the cabin fever that people have over winter and said, like, hey, why don't you come out and plant everything all in the spring? That's because that's when everybody wants to get out and start doing stuff.
True.
What I think that people don't really understand is that fall is one of the best times to actually plant most things. Now, not everything, just most, because what that does is that it gives you about 6 months of establishment time for the following year before the next summer hits. Because summer is actually the most stressful time for plants a lot of times, just because of the heat, the wind, lack of water, et cetera, et cetera. But when you plant in the fall, the roots are still continuing to grow. It's actually a really important time for plant root development, is because they're usually growing during the fall and the first part of winter month. And most root development occurs at temperatures above 36 degrees. So even in the winter, when the soil temperatures are still a little warmer, they'll still grow during that time. So that way it has enough of a root system to not have to fight so much with the heat the following spring. Because I see a lot of people, they plant everything in the spring, and then 3 weeks later it just gets so hot and so windy that they end up losing their landscape. So they're just trying to baby stuff to keep them along.
We don't have much of a spring. So in other areas, like if people are used to gardening not in Utah's high desert, they have a month or 6 weeks of springtime where they're getting a good rain and they're getting cool temps, and it's an easy transition for plants. Whereas in Utah, as we all know, that especially this year, it was extreme. It was cold till it wasn't. It was hot till it wasn't. There's no downtime. And so for us in particular here in Utah, it's actually the fall, I think, is a more forgiving, easier time than the springtime, even though most nurseries, like in Cameron's business, they bring in now bring in springtime instead of in the fall, because that's when people are thinking about getting out of the house because they've had their cabin fever, as he puts it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and see, here at the nursery, where we're one of the only nurseries that actually do their own production. We do most of our production for the following year. So in 2021. We're planting that between pretty much August up until the middle of September. We're planting 5,000 5-gallon Carl Forster grasses as we speak. So
what?
For sale, for sale in April. Yeah, my least favorite grass. But yeah, so I'll have those available in April, and I'm planting them now. So we don't have to do anything other than just stick them in a pot and let them sit.
We do have a question on Utah Gardeners that relates to this. Emily Gunderson asks, is it too early or late to transplant raspberry starts?
Ooh.
And Emily, it's I would say it's actually a little early because we're still hitting 90 during the day, waiting until the temps are a little bit cooler so that you're still getting root development once you plant, but you're not struggling to keep them and their tiny little baby roots watered heavily in high temps during the day is ideal. So next week we're in the 80s and slowly going down. And so next week anytime would probably be better than right away. And then they should be just fine. Just keep them a little moist through the wintertime because raspberries have shallower root systems, especially as they're getting established. And so if you wait and they kind of desiccate themselves and dry out over the wintertime, if you have a dry spate, it can take longer to come back in the spring, or you could lose it if in an extreme case if we have a ton of drought, but that's usually not the case. But I would put a little bit of water on it up until it gets much cooler or we have some rain or snow.
Interesting. One question I have there along those lines, I've heard with raspberries, you really probably, aside from transplanting it in your own yard, it's always best to buy them from a nursery because if you're getting cuttings from a neighbor, you might be inviting disease. Is that a true understanding?
Yeah, and yes, that's true. And I would add to that, don't transplant from your own yard. And if you're buying from a nursery, make sure that nursery is using certified disease-free stock and that they're not dividing what they have and selling that off as well. Because I know that that does occasionally happen. So raspberries are particularly prone to viral infections, particularly, and viral infections, while not super contagious in terms of like jumping from plant to plant and yard to yard, it does happen when you're dividing plants that are infected and moving them around the space. And so if you have like a nursery that has like, okay, I've got 20 raspberry plants and I'll split them all and then I'll have 40 for next year or whatever. Or if you're dividing your own and you have the disease and you're going to move it to another section of your yard or increase, you can be just transplanting that viral infection. For example, there's a virus called like fruit breaking virus that you get on raspberries, and what it causes is those drupes, the combined little baby fruits all together make your one big raspberry, right? And so it caused that fruit to fall apart and crumble. And so that breaking virus the plants look healthy, they look big, everything looks fine, but your fruit is constantly falling apart. And people will say, oh, you're not getting enough water, or, oh, it's not enough sun, or oh, it's this and that. And then you're transplanting that or dividing it all over your yard to find a better spot, and it's just diseased and you should have started over. So some viral infections just look like an abiotic issue, and they're not. It's viral. So even when your plants look healthy and things look fine, it may not be. And so just starting over is with disease-free certified stock from a reputable nursery is always going to be better for you.
Gotcha. That makes a ton of sense.
Hey, Liz.
Yeah.
You're really smart.
No, I'm not. I just absorb the information and regurgitate it. There's lots of people out there that can do that.
I was thinking the same thing as she was talking. I was like, wow, I'm so happy she's here because I wouldn't be able to do any of that. Oh my gosh. Okay, so I just read a question here. We are getting a ton of questions, by the way.
We are. There's so many.
Absolutely. We might need to do this much more often. So Brenda Smith-Ovison has asked, I have 3 trees that were basically stripped of their leaves during the hurricane, quote unquote, last week. She is at the base of the canyons in Centerville, so she was hit hard. She asks, will my trees be stressed from now until they go dormant for winter? What can she do to help them? The trees are 1 peach, 1 newly spring-planted wireless Zelkova. Ooh, we love Zelkovas. And 1 spring-planted...
Wireless. That's a hard one to find.
Really? And then she has 1 spring-planted white flowering crab apple.
So the spring-planted ones will be stressed, and they don't love it. But there's really nothing you can do for them. Just keep water on them and sing to them. Probably would help. The ones that are established are going to be fine. They'll be fine. You don't want to give fertilizer right now as trees are going dormant because most fertilizer is going to stimulate new growth, and that's not what you want. Tender new growth is not what you want going into the fall. So just let it go dormant, give it some water, and cross your fingers. But I'm on the spring planted ones, but your established stuff will be just fine.
Yeah. The only thing that I would probably really caution about is not overwatering, because if the leaves were stripped off of these trees, they're not going to have the ability to shed excess water.
Right, they can't respirate.
They can't respirate. So sometimes you end up killing them with kindness when you're trying to help them. So honestly, I would tell you to not do really much of anything other than just let them do what they normally do, because trees are tough. I mean, you'd be really surprised what they can kind of put up with. So,
Well, and I'll just throw out a quick plug for last week's episode. I had Cameron here. We answered a lot of these types of questions because we really kind of focused on just trees and the things that you should and shouldn't do after this massive, storm that impacted so many of us. So, Brenda, if you haven't listened to last week's episode, which was episode 21 of Gardening Utah, head on back, and maybe there's some other things that we could help you with as well. All right, Liz, what other questions are sticking out to you right now?
Well, I got one.
Go ahead.
Well, there's Susan Hall is asking, is hot boxing really worth it? And I'm not quite sure that I know what that means, but because when I was in college, hot boxing meant something completely different than anything. Well, it had to do with horticulture, but I'm just wondering if it's appropriate for this particular forum.
Well, I mean, yeah, I saw that question too and thought the same thing. That's actually the perfect question to lead into the break because we do have 1 minute left of this segment. But I thought, I think I do know what she means in the gardening space. So what do you think?
The only thing that I can really think of is just like if she's like, like running like a cold frame or something like that.
I think she just means putting a cold frame over a raised bed or maybe tarp.
Yeah.
Or not tarp, but black plastic. Is that what you think, Liz?
That's what I was thinking. I don't have any scientific information on that one.
Yes, Liz, but please share what you think about hot boxing.
I'm assuming she's either... Here's what I think she's meaning. I think she might mean either making your raised bed warmer. I'm just looking at Cameron here and he's laughing so hard. So it's hard for me to not laugh. And then I was thinking, I almost said maybe she's talking about hotboxing the greenhouse, and that doesn't make sense either because that could be multi-dimensional.
I just asked her. I just responded and was like,
all right, so after this,
elaborate.
When we come back after this break, we're going to find out exactly what was meant with regard to hotboxing, and we'll be right back after this with Gardening Utah. Stay with us.
860 KKAT with Jenna Francis and Gardening Utah, where it's always mulch time. She really does have the nicest yard on the block. It's Gardening Utah with Jenna Francis on 860 KKAT.
Welcome back to Gardening Utah. I'm your host, Jenna Francis, and with me here is horticulturist Liz Hamilton and Cameron Alcott from Progressive Plants. Guys, this has been fun so far.
Yes,
oh, yeah.
Good times.
So we are answering listeners' questions. We're getting a little bit more clarification on the question that we answered at the end of the last break. But meanwhile, we're going to get to a few topics that a lot of these questions have a very similar theme, and one of them is spider mites. So Jamie Hobbs is asking, is there anything I can do as I clean up my plants this fall to prevent spider mites next year? They were awful this year.
Oh boy. Yeah, that's a tough one. I don't think I've ever seen quite the year for spider mites.
Yeah, the spider mites prefer dry and dusty conditions. And this is one of the driest summers we've had on record. And super dusty. I mean, with the ash coming down and just the wind that we have had. I mean, remember how windy June was and how crazy? And then, of course, we had hurricane season last week, so that was nuts. But that picks up that dust and it drops it down onto your plants. And so between dry, dusty, hot, it has been like a booming year for spider mites. I've seen them in places I've never seen them before.
I have seen them on a lot of things. And weeping white spruce specifically have been really bad. And then a lot on burning bush this year.
Yeah, raspberries. We talked about raspberries earlier, but raspberries have just been getting decimated. And roses. I had a whole rose I had to trim literally to the ground and take every leaf off of it because the infestation was so bad I didn't think it would recover if I left the leaves on it. So in terms of doing stuff to prevent spider mites for next year, horticultural dormant oil is going to be the best thing that you can do to prevent stuff, because as its name implies, you wait till the leaves fall off and then you're going to spray that plant, making sure to get all the branches and then the trunk really, really well. And what that does is it comes in and it coats into every little nook and cranny, and then it gets into those like leaf scars and bud scales that are getting ready to pop for next year, as that is where spider mites hibernate and overwinter, either as adults themselves or as their eggs. And so a dormant oil spray in late winter after the plant has lost all of its leaves, like in end of November, early December, is good. And then the next treatment, usually in early March, just to really knock anything out that you might have missed in the late winter or early winter is going to be ideal. And that way you get 2 treatments in before anything pops up.
Hey, Liz, I've got a question for you.
Yeah.
Do you need to keep anything different in mind if you're spraying conifers? Because I know like sometimes with a lot of different sprays, they can be phytotoxic. Do we need to be concerned about that with dormant oil as well?
So I would just make sure that the dormant oil that you use is rated for evergreens if you have evergreens to spray, because there are some that are like a 2% dormant oil and they're super viscous and it will coat that leaf. And if you have like an evergreen waxy leaf, it's going to end up suffocating the stoma that are in there that the plant uses to breathe, and then it'll drop its needles, drop its leaves, and die, which isn't what you want, or severely stunt the plant. So making sure, but you can use a lighter oil, like a light horticultural oil, because some are rated for summer use, but that you can also use in the wintertime, or it'll say all season dormant oil or all season horticultural oil on it instead of dormant oil on the label. And you can use that as a dormant oil, and most of those are rated for conifers. So just making sure that you have one that lists a plant specifically is going to be ideal.
Yeah, and that's the one thing that I want to remind, like pretty much like all of your listeners, is make sure you always read the labels for the plants, because I notice a lot of different types of chemicals that have different purposes are toxic to certain types of plants. Like for instance, like different pre-emergents are good for different type of situations. Because I've got issues where, like, so sometimes I have to use a pre-emergent for like honeysuckles, but I can't use them with hydrangeas and vice versa. So make sure that you are always reading the labels, and because they'll usually list some sort of degree of phytotoxicity between them.
Right, and that includes anything organic. I mean, dormant oil and horticultural oil are both organic, but they will strip your plants and kill them if you use them in the wrong application. And then, and to tag on to that question, Carolyn Davis asked, I had a horrible aphid issue this year. Is there something I can do to avoid those? And it was under the spider mite question. Dormant oil will also knock out aphid populations because they also overwinter their larvae and their eggs in leaf scale and bud scale. And so spraying early on with a dormant oil is going to be really good for plants that had aphid issues as well as spider mites.
Courtney Shore is saying, what things being pulled out of the garden box at the end of the season can be composted and what shouldn't be?
That's being pulled out of the garden box. So anything that was sick should probably not be composted. If you know what it was sick with, then that might be a little bit different, but I wouldn't compost it. Anything that wasn't really having an issue, you can go ahead and compost that, because most like insect and fungal issues will die in a composting situation. Bacteria depends. And so, like for instance, if you know you have bacterial black spot on your tomato plants, I would not compost that. But if you had powdery mildew on your squash, you could compost that if you know that your compost is getting up to the right degree to burn that powdery mildew away. And the caveat there is that most people don't get it hot enough.
Yep.
So if you know you had disease and you know that you're not really like managing your compost super great, then maybe that's not something you want to add. But if you know you're going to keep that compost really hot and you're going to turn it regularly, then go ahead and compost all of that. Things that were insect infested are probably fine to compost, again, if you know that your compost is going to get hot. For example, spider mites tend to, if they're not going to overwinter in your leaf buds and your leaf scale, and you have a different variety of spider mites like tomato russet mite, they actually overwinter in soil. They wait for those leaves to fall off the plants because it's an annual, and they're going to overwinter in the soil, and then you plant tomatoes in that or anything else in that spot again next year, then you're going to end up with infested plants again, because they're just going to crawl out of the soil and get all over everything. So if you're going to go ahead and compost something like that, and maybe you had spider mites, if you're going to get up hot enough, go ahead and compost it. If you're concerned and you're not really following that composter, maybe that's something you ought to just chuck. So just kind of being aware of issues your garden may have faced this spring and summer is going to tell you what you can and can't compost this fall. But generally speaking, everything should and could be composted as long as it's disease-free and you're bringing up your compost to the accurate temperature that it needs to really burn it down.
Very good tips. So we'll be right back with more of your questions, particularly around composting, right after this. Stay with us.
She's more than just gardening puns and sage advice. It's Gardening Utah with Jenna Francis on 860 KKAT. 860 KKAT with more of the fastest growing show on radio. It's Gardening Utah with Jenna Francis.
Welcome back to Gardening Utah. I'm your host, Jenna Francis, with Cameron Alcott from Progressive Plants and horticulturist Liz Hamilton answering your fall gardening questions today. We are talking composting right now. That seems to be a big theme of questions in the group today. And Paulette is asking, she says, I just started a compost bin and I'm going to have tons of leaves to rake. Should I add them all or pile them somewhere in the yard where I can add them as I add kitchen scraps? I'm trying to get a balance of browns and greens. And then we also have a question from Jennifer that kind of segues that says, what should I add to my leaf mulch to help it break it down over the winter?
So what you want when you're starting at the compost pile is a ratio of 2-to-1 greens to browns. So 2 greens to every 1 brown. And if you have a ton of leaf mulch or leaves, which are considered browns, and not that much green, you're going to end up with the incorrect ratio to get your compost as hot as you need it, so that everything breaks down correctly. So what you can do, and I'll also say, not just, it's going to be easier on you if you don't just rake your leaves into a pile, you should shred them. So like rake them into a windrow and then run them over with a bagging mower if you have access to a bagging mower, and then take those and add that to your compost pile instead of just piling complete leaves on there. Shredded leaves are always better and they break down faster. And then collect your greens, and then if you have a pile of browns, add those back in as you add more greens to your compost pile. So have your designated compost pile, you're adding greens, and then add that. So for every 2 of greens, you add 1 scoop of browns or whatever, if that answers the question. And then for that, in terms of what can you add to your leaf mulch to help it break down over the winter, which was Jennifer Briggs' question, which is, what should I add to my leaf mulch to help it break down over the winter? And her question is, do I use blood meal? And so what you can use is any form of nitrogen, which blood meal is. Blood meal is an organic form of nitrogen, and that works. But typically what a lot of people will use is urea, so unpelleted nitrogen, which is usually like a 4600 if you buy that at the store. And nitrogen is super hot, and so you can fold that like immediate and see like an instantaneous heat. Like often you can see that smoking and steaming right away when you add urea. So blood meal is a good one, but it's going to be a slow burn and it's going to take a little bit to convert into nitrogen. Urea is going to be working on contact, and so that's another option. And it's just nitrogen. There's nothing else in it. And make sure you're buying unpelleted urea and not anything that's pelleted, because then it's going to take a while to break down, and unpelleted is going to be instant use on that.
Gotcha.
And then somebody else also asked, is it better to add compost now or in the spring? Oh, that's Kayleen Anderson Whitelock.
Yeah.
Is it better to add compost now or in the spring? And I assume she's asking about the garden.
Yeah.
And you should add compost Anytime. If your compost isn't super broken down, if it's still kind of working on it, now is good because then it can sit in that fall garden all winter long and break down even further. If it's broken down really well now, you can add it now or in the spring, either one. And then somebody else asked, what organic items can I till into my garden?
Yeah.
And is it better to till in the fall or the spring? So that was Brianna and Bailey asked those two questions in conjunction. And organic items that you can till into your garden are things like the blood meal that we just mentioned, bone meal is good. And then compost. Animal manure is good now because it takes the fall to break down and then it's ready to go by the time you get done in the spring or get ready to get going in the spring. And then Bailey asked, is it better to till in the fall or the spring? And it sort of depends on your garden. I would say if you're going to till, because you also hear about no-till, but if you're planning on tilling, I think once of each is best. So at the end of the season and then again in the spring. And I say that because tilling is good for controlling insects. And so if you had squash bugs, if you had aphids, if you had spider mites, turning that soil over and exposing it, if you have cutworms and armyworms that are nesting in the soil, things like that, turning that soil over, exposing that to sunlight, and then tilling that under and slowly destroying that population is what tilling is extra good for. And that's why they use it usually in commercial enterprises and stuff, because you're lowering your pest load when you're tilling. But again, that also applies to your beneficial insects as well. So you're tilling those under too. So something to think about. It's give and take there.
I've always wondered that. Well, because I listen to so many gardening podcasts, and a lot of them, especially ones in the UK, are talking so much about no-till, just add to your soil. And I've been really struggling with this lately.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some merit to both ideas. And, the science behind the studies in that, like, should I till my garden or should I not? You can have great results with both, but the science behind it kind of says it depends. It depends on when you're tilling and what you're tilling and why you're tilling. And tilling can be really good for some things, like if you're growing a carrot patch and you're starting with really compacted soil. If you have soil that's really rocky or really clayey, tilling in things that are going to help break that down and flocculate that soil or break those molecules down are going to be, better than just trying to layer stuff on the surface and hope that works. And so, there's mixed reviews out there, but the science says, yeah, it's great in some things and it's better to try and till in others. And for me, as somebody who ran 2 demonstration gardens that were side by side, I ran a conventional garden, edible garden, and a no-till all organic garden. And they were and of course you can't be certified organic because I was too close to the conventional garden, but they were managed differently. And so for me, I would say in the conventional garden, I had much lower pest loads. And I think that's because I tilled everything under and got rid of them. And got rid of much of them. And in the no-till garden, I had higher pest loads, but which was more difficult to deal with because it was an organic space. But it was cooler. It wasn't as hot. And so the plants seemed healthy, even though maybe they had some pest issues. And so, working in it was easier because I wasn't exhausted and hot all the time and things like that. So there were some benefits. I mean, you could walk from the conventional garden across, the 10-foot barrier that we had in between them and end up in that no-till, and it was significantly degrees cooler.
Wow.
I mean, just from going from one to the other, because the other one had more, I think, like residual humidity coming from the bark decomposing and the water retention that it had that I wasn't getting in the conventional side. So, I mean, either one is going to be it sort of depends on your style and what's going to work for you and what works in your space and what your soil is. So there's not one really right answer there. But if you're going to till in the fall until again, and then let it sit all exposed. So don't till it and then make it like rake it all down and make it look beautiful. Till it and leave it tilled up, and then rake it down, knock it down, till it, and make it look beautiful in the springtime.
Aha. Oh, that's a fantastic tip. Okay, I got it.
Hey, so I got an answer to what hotboxing is.
Oh, you did. Here we go. Let's hear it.
So Susan writes, evidently people are putting tarps, their pulled beds, planting boxes, and the heat will kill the bugs in the soil like grubs and whatever. So I think she's kind of talking about like solarization.
Oh, solarization.
Yeah, which I know we normally do for like weeds and stuff like that. So that's what she means by hotboxing, not the giving it the old college try. Yeah. And I don't know how you feel about this, Liz, but I've never really been a big fan of like solarization, or I know that there's people are trying to be more organic, use like less chemicals, but it seems like a lot of these methods are actually more detrimental to soil health than just, isolating and doing like a spot treatment for something, if that kind of makes sense. Because when you generate that much heat, you kind of kill some of your bugs, but you're also killing all of the beneficial flora, all of the microorganisms that your plants will use in order to
heat is an organic indiscriminate killer.
Yes.
To put it that way.
Like Ted Bundy.
So okay, just like him. Heat is an indiscriminate killer, and so two thoughts on that. If you're solarizing now, no, it's not worth it, because we're headed into the cool season and you need hot temperatures in the summer to do that. And so, no, now it's not going to be worth it, and it's not going to be effective. And if you're talking about just in general, to maybe use next spring going into the summer, it's only effective in the top, I think in the studies they did, it's like 3 to 5 inches of soil. And so if you have deep-rooted perennial weeds like, the dreaded common bindweed, if you have white top, if you have Bermuda grass, quackgrass, those weeds are just going to laugh in the face of your solarization, and they will be right back, and you've done nothing to get rid of them. If your only issue is shallow-rooted annual weeds like chickweed and Veronica, speedwell, and things like that, and you're just trying to get rid of that heavy seed load, then it's effective, but and it would work. I think the things to consider is that it takes a while. It's not instantaneous. You got to leave it up for a month or two. And if you're trying to plant also in the spring, you're eating into your planting time. And by the time the solarization has gotten around to working, you're looking at midsummer, which is not an ideal time for planting. And it's not attractive to look at while you're doing it. And then it's also, kind of labor intensive to put down, I think, and then take back up. And again, like you mentioned, you're killing all of the good in the top 5 inches of soil as well as the bad. You're killing your seed load, but you've killed any worms, you've killed any microorganisms, you've killed any, fungal, abiotic, things like that. You've kind of gotten rid of all of those other issues as well, which might be what you want if you have things like, cutworms and stuff in your grass, but.
Yeah. Well, believe it or not, we only have 30 seconds left of this episode, and I can't even believe it's gone so fast. But we have a question from Barbara, and she asks what to cut down to the ground. Mums, daylilies, ornamental grasses? That's a big question. We might need to answer some after the show, but give them the nuts and bolts, Cameron.
I would say go ahead and cut all of those things down after they have been frost damaged enough and are no longer actively growing. So probably November-ish.
Awesome. So if you're listening to this on the radio, you can download this episode on Apple Podcasts. It is episode 22 of Gardening Utah, and you will hear more of our conversation on that episode. Thank you so much for listening. Thanks for being here, you guys.
Thank you so much for having us.
Well, that's all for today's episode of Gardening Utah. Thank you so much to Liz and Cameron for joining me again. I'm telling you, Liz is such a genius. And look, she was also on episode 9 of Gardening Utah, so you can go on back and have a listen to her on that episode as well. And if you're listening to this on KKAT Radio, you can go to Gardening Utah on Apple Podcast and listen to more from Cameron and Liz just by searching episode 22. All right. Thank you so much for listening. Shout out to our producer, Lambo. I'm Jana Francis. See you next week here on Gardening Utah. And remember, grow big or go home.
When you're ready to grow big or go home, make your neighbors green with envy. Get the Gardening in Utah podcast, Gardening Utah, available wherever you get your podcasts and at 860kkat.com/garden.